And I said to myself, okay, well, what will the world be like in 2050? Well, the best estimates are there'll be something like 10 billion people. And today there are approximately 8 billion. So we have an incremental 2 billion people. And those people are going to come primarily from 9 countries. And those countries are India, Nigeria, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Indonesia, the United States. So essentially, we're going to add 2 billion poor people, primarily in Africa and Central Asia. And at the same time, the concentration of wealth will get worse. So, for example, the US and China today are something like 42% of global GDP. In the year 2050, no one really knows, of course, but it's going to be somewhere between 50 and 60%. So 2 countries will have 50 or 60% of the world's wealth, and there'll be 2 billion more poor people. Now, we already know what it looks like when you have that kind of inequality, both within countries and across countries. Just about everything you can think about is not good. Migration, disease, terrorism, climate change, etc. So I look at that and I say to myself, if we had any kind of, as it were, strategic planning going on for the world, raise your hand if you think it's a good idea that in that world I just described, that the world's, pick your number, most powerful, wealthiest 10 countries, 5 countries, or how about the 2 countries? Who thinks it's a good idea that in that world, those 2 countries should spend most of their time fighting with each other? I mean, it can't make any sense at all. And so I look at that world and I say to myself, well, wait a minute. Right now, the way I feel about it, it's like we're heading over a cliff. We're persuading ourselves, and it's kind of like a escalating negative game. Both sides are persuading themselves that the other one's nefarious, malevolent, and it's getting worse and worse, and it can't make any sense. And so then I scratch my head and say, well, now how are we going to get ourselves out of this trap? Out of this trap? And it's not obvious, particularly when you have regard to what I said a minute ago about Hofstadter, because our own country domestically is going to be, in my opinion, politically ill for a while. So with that, if I can call it that reality, that makes the task that much more difficult. So there are only 2 things I'm kind of I'm hoping will exist. One is that other countries will in fact increasingly over time, more forcefully, say to the United States and China, I'm sorry, it's simply not acceptable for the 2 of you not to have a constructive relationship. The world cannot exist if that's the case, and you got to stop it. And you see some of that happening right now. One of the things that kind of interests me, I don't want to take a tangent, but I'll just quickly go through this. If you look at the Russian-Ukrainian war, and if you were following just the English language media, English language communication channels, which dominate the world's communication channels, you could be forgiven for thinking that the sanctions on Russia are basically a good idea and are essentially working. And most people see it that way. Until you get into the fine print and you realize that of the 54 African countries, the number supporting the sanctions is 0. Of the 32 Latin American countries, the number supporting the sanctions is 0. Of the 22 Middle Eastern countries, the number supporting the sanctions is 0. The 48 Asian countries, number supporting the sanctions are 3. South Korea, Japan, Singapore. 16 Pacific Island countries, 2. Australia and New Zealand. So I just named you 175 countries, 5 of which are supporting the sanctions. So the sanctions are essentially an American, Western European, and a few American allies, essentially in Asia and Australasia. Now, the relevance of that is that it does show you a certain kind of fissure that exists that you don't hear a lot about. And the positive side of which may be, this is the question, may be, that all those other countries over time will say to both the United States and China, as I said earlier, it's just not acceptable for you all not to have a decent relationship. And China, by the way, is already the largest trading partner with 140 of those countries. And China, I was just in China earlier this week, listening to there's a new sort of, well, a more prominent form of a term of art the Chinese are using called Chinese modernization. And they're determined to illustrate to the world that modernization and westernization are not synonymous. And that modernization can take different forms in different countries. And I was listening to the foreign minister lay all this out, and among the other things he cited was, in no particular order, China's contributed more to global growth in the last decade than all G7 countries put together. 1.4 billion people in China are more than all the developed world put together. They're the leading trader with 140 countries. The trade between China and ASEAN, this is amazing. The trade between China and ASEAN is bigger than the trade between the United States and the EU. So when you start going down through these things, you realize there's a certain reality here that sooner or later the Americans are going to have to accept. And my own opinion is the sooner that gets understood and accepted, the better, and that the relationship has got to get better, because if it doesn't get better, then everything I was saying about 2050, let alone 2070 or 2100, is just going off a cliff. So John Kerry told me that in, I think it was 2013, he was the senior American at one of these international meetings that Obama could not attend for one reason or another. And so he was the person who took the meeting with Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping in that meeting said to John Kerry, by the way, let me tell you about something I'm thinking about. And he laid out the One Belt, One Road. And Kerry said to him, oh, that's very interesting. Why don't we do this together? And Xi Jinping says, that's a great idea. Let's do this together. And Kerry came back to Washington, and he said before he got off the plane, the Treasury Mandarin said, cut his legs off, and there was no chance it was going to happen. So it never got to Obama's desk as kind of a strategic question. But I tell you that story because if you were reading today the characterization of One Belt, One Road, you would think this was some kind of malevolent tactic to get control of the world on the part of the Chinese, which it is not. It is exactly what it's said, what they say it is, which is to extend a model of development into as many countries as it wanted, who desperately need it. And when I talked earlier about Chinese modernization that I attended this last Monday, so Chinese modernization, I won't go into all the details, but there basically are 5 central characteristics of it, one of which is a peaceful world. Second one of which is common prosperity. Third one of which is harmony between man and nature. So the foreign minister went through this whole thing, and then there were 5 of us asked to comment on it. And I said, in my comments, I said, listen, those of us who have ever run anything know, plans are one thing, execution is another. Execution is the whole thing. So my advice to you, the Chinese, would be, if you're going to hold yourself out as believing in these things, I mean, who's against any of these things? Who's against world peace? Who's against harmony between man and nature? Who's against common prosperity? Nobody. 10 out of 10 people. There's nobody in this room who's going to be against any of these things. So that's not the issue. The issue is, are you actually going to do what you say you do? And if you don't, you're going to suffer the same negative blowback that countries like the United States get when they were seen as being hypocritical. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, which is extremely important, and a point I want to make to all of you, which I made to the Chinese till I'm blue in the face very unsuccessfully, which is, when I first started spending a lot of time in China was I was chairman of Goldman Sachs Asia in the mid-90s into 2000. At a point in time when the Chinese system was just starting to open up, and they were just starting to put state-owned enterprises into Western markets, and Zhu Rongji was the premier, or vice premier, then premier, and he was a very unusual person. and he really cared about getting this right. And I happened to be there, and I was very senior, so I was in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to give him advice in a way that will probably never occur again, because the Chinese were so in need of the advice. But one thing that struck me about them was the Chinese leadership, on almost every topic, not every topic, but almost every topic, was systematically open in the following sense. They started with the premise there's somebody in the world who knows this topic better than we do. Let's get that somebody to Beijing. Let's drain his brain. Let's study what he had to say, see if it applies to us, refine it and customize for our circumstance, and then execute. And they did this time after time after time, which is why back in those days you would have seen both Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji routinely meeting with Western CEOs, Western superb academics, Nobel Prize winners and so forth, Western head of NGOs. They met with them routinely, one-on-one, because they knew they were getting very high quality information coming in from people who didn't work for them, and good information was coming back the other way. That started to stop a few years ago, but that's another topic. Okay, here we are. The power configuration in the current world should not be defined as competition between China and the United States for hegemony. Rather, we witness a shift from the situation in which a single civilization dominated the globe to common prosperity of diverse civilizations. What China has inaugurated is not a Chinese century, but a century of diverse civilizations, a new era in which there will no longer be a single civilizational hegemon. And that's exactly the way the Chinese see it. As opposed to, Joe Biden says this is the century of democracies versus autocracies. Some of the funnier, more clever Chinese will say, no, it's the plutocracy versus the meritocracy. Which gets to the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, the best way to think about that is the Chinese Communist Party is essentially the meritocratic elite. In the same way that if you look back through Chinese history, there was an emperor, and then there was the kind of the Mandarin class running the country. Mm-hmm. That's essentially what you have at the moment. And you don't get into the Chinese Communist Party if you're not very able. You don't get to Tsinghua University if you're not very able. 10 million kids a year take the national examinations to go to university. The top 3,000 of those go to Tsinghua University. 3,000 get admitted and 3,000 go. And so, and Tsinghua University accounts for 50% of the leadership of the country. So that the examination-based culture, which has existed for 2,000 years, still exists, and essentially, that's what drives the input into all these institutions. And so to put it in the vernacular, if you get to the top of the Chinese system, there's no chance you're not very smart and very able. And the only institution in this country which is, to me, is at all like it, and when I tell them this, it drives them crazy, the only institution in this country that's at all like the Chinese Communist Party is the U.S. military. Which is to say that if you and I were 18 years old and we went to West Point together, and we went in the military and we stayed in the military, one day we're 4-star generals, we've known each other for, whatever it is, 40 years, and we're sitting around the same table. That's the Chinese system. And so they know each other intimately. They've had real jobs. They failed or they succeeded. If they succeeded, they went ahead. If they failed, they failed. And like all big organizations, there, of course, is plenty of rough justice and infighting and all the rest of it that goes on in every corporation in the United States and anywhere else. But that's basically the system. So I think the word communist kind of gets into the mental way of Americans understanding what you're dealing with. It's not a communist system, period. Which doesn't mean they don't have, when they talk about common prosperity, for example, you might say that's the equivalent of trying to fix income inequality that we would talk about. But the other day, another Chinese was saying to me the capitalist system is essentially a divide and conquer system. The Chinese modernization is a unifying system. And so so Xi Jinping, to go back to him, he is determined, although they haven't figured out how to do this yet, that common prosperity is for real. They're proud of the fact they've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Of course, that's the most ever in history by a long, long way. And they're proud of that. And they think those people ought to continue to advance. And that this, these big, big differences between the wealthy and the poor is too much. And that's why you see them sort of cracking down now on some of that.